Okay, well today Heather McCue is one of our longest time members of the user group, longer than me, and she is quite the expert in many things like HIPAA and other fun stuff, and I've learned lots of things from her over the years. Her topic today is the virtual versus JSON, so we're going to be talking about virtual lists and JSON, and boy, I love JSON stuff. I'm using it a whole bunch too, but hoping to learn a few more little things from Heather today. Heather, we're glad to have you.
All right, thank you, thank you. All right, so for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Heather McCue. I'm lead developer at Harmonic Software Production Studios. We're located down in Addison, and our address is on that flyer, so come visit us next week. So I'm going to talk about virtual versus JSON. Before I get into it, I want to tell you that what I'm discussing today and what I'm sharing is not theoretical. Everything here that I'm talking about is based on firsthand experience, both with virtual lists and with JSON. And I'm going to be giving you a few specific examples. There are many, many more. There are also many more resources available out there for topics like virtual lists and JSON, particularly virtual lists. If you want to know, you want to get example files and things like that, just do a Google for virtual lists and FileMaker, and you're going to find so much out there. There are videos, there are sample files, and I thought I didn't want to spend my time putting together something that's redundant of what's like freely already out there, and I didn't also just want to share all those resources that are out there. They're just so easy to find. I wanted to spend my time sharing what I've done specifically so I can impart some of what I've learned and some of my things that I think are pretty cool. Some of you may look at what I've done and think, oh yeah, I did that years ago or something, but I think some of this stuff is pretty cool, so I'm excited to share it with you. So first off, let's talk about virtual lists. Has everyone here, or let me re-ask the question, is there anyone here who has not used virtual list? Okay, excellent. So most of you have used virtual lists. You're familiar with the basics, right? So what it is magic. Okay, and the reason it's magic, if you think about it, magicians they're illusionists, right? Everything they do is a trick, and that is what the virtual list technique is. It's temporary, and it's a trick. It's not a workaround. Workarounds are something completely different. This is a technique. It's a valid technique. It's been used in, it's been around since 2009, thanks to Bruce Robertson, who invented it. He's really a genius. If any of you have the opportunity to meet him at Claris Engage, I urge you to spend a few minutes chatting with him. Anyway, so that's what it is. It's magic. Okay? We're going to talk about how it works. Most of you have used it, so you're familiar with the basics. We'll also talk about why we use it, and of course the reason we use it is because it's magic, right? And we all like good tricks and good techniques. So here's a super simple recap of how virtual lists work. Basically, we set values into variables. In this example, we're setting a list of colors, and we get red, white, and blue as a return delimited list. We set that into our variable, global variable var, and then we have an unstored calc and a virtual list table that pulls its value from the variables, literally using get value from the var, get record number. That's the simplest version of a virtual list setup. Set the variable, pull the variable. It's that easy. But there are a couple different options to keep in mind. First off, you can use a return delimited list like we have here in the previous example, where variable A is just a return delimited list of red, white, and blue. In that case, record 1 is going to look for the first value, pull it in, so record 1 is going to be red, record 2 is going to be white, record 3 is going to show blue. Okay? But we can also use variable repetitions. So variable get record number is what we're going to use. And in that case, variable B, repetition 1, is going to go into record 1. Record 2 is going to look at variable B, repetition 2, etc. There are a lot of reasons to use repetitions versus a return delimited list. The first one that I came across personally, I'll get to you in just a second. The first one I came across personally was that I needed to set into my variable a value that had returns in it, right? Because it was a text block, and someone had put in a paragraph return. Well, that will screw up your variables and it'll screw up the order of your records, but your repetitions, your variable repetitions will not have a problem with that. You can have returns, whatever you want in there, and it'll stay in there. Yes, Dennis?
Every so often there's a discussion going on in the founding community where somebody decides to tell me that I'm making a big mistake to use repetitions.
Uh-huh.
And how antiquated they are.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And how the only reason they exist is because they are legacy things from FileMaker 3 or something.
Uh-huh.
And I always think of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
But these aren't repetitions in the repeating field, which is I think what people usually complain about. These are repetitions in the variable.
Did a demonstration of something that had one field with 100 repetitions.
Yes.
How tidy and convenient it was. So you should thank me for not making those people connect with you and argue with you instead of me.
I personally have a long history with repetitions that goes back to the previous century, and I love them. I love them. I agree with the critics who say this is not a good place to store data permanently, right? It's not, you can't search them easily. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people have issues with repetitions, but there are also a lot of very cool things you can do with repetitions. Repetitions are incredibly smart if you understand how to work with them. So obviously variable repetitions or repeating variables are not the same as repeating fields, but I got to tell you, I got a little bit of a chill and a giggle when I found that we could do repeating variables because you can do some pretty cool things. And you'll see a little bit more about repetitions in my examples here. Another reason for doing repetitions is that it is, it's faster, right? So you also don't need to worry about blank spaces, right? What if you have no data for the 6th record for that value? Well, in a return delimited list, you'd have to account for that with an extra return and a blank space. And that gets a little difficult to manage if your lists get longer and longer, right? And how you're assembling them becomes a little more problematic, whereas if you're using repetitions, you simply don't create that variable for repetition 6, right? And it'll just work, right? So I find that to be just simpler. And then, of course, Jeremy Banty says that the rep is faster than the return delimited list, and he has a lot of experience with virtual list work, which I'll show you a couple examples of here as well. It's faster because just like JSON, where every time you look at it, it has to evaluate the whole thing. When you do get value from a return delimited list, it starts at the beginning. And it goes until it gets to the right one, and then it pulls it. So the longer your value lists, the more work it's doing every time it has to look at it. The repetitions, it just gets what it wants. It's right there. It's very fast. So it's much more efficient and performant.
So when you use it, that's interesting. When you use a repetition, a repeating variable, and you put the rep number into a get $$ variable repetition number 47.
Right.
That's like an index, and it tells it to go right to that cell.
Exactly.
But it doesn't work the same way when you say get value 47?
No, because it has to,
Count to 47?
it's got to count to 47 and pull it out. Basically it has to evaluate. I mean, I wouldn't say that it evaluates past 47. I'm sure it stops at 47.
Yeah.
But what if you're looking at 212?
Right.
So it's just a lot faster.
For what it's worth, at least in my experience, which is not as expensive as Jeremy Daniels, but you got to have a lot of values in your variable before the speed advantage of the repetitions becomes really significant. I think the advantages of the repetitions are just cleaner, and it eliminates the problem of having to escape all of those returns. If you've got value with returns in it, you have to turn them into something else and then turn them back into returns.
And even in your debugging, when you're looking in your data viewer at your repetitions, if you're trying to find a certain location within your return delimited list, it's just a pain, right?
But if you have a very simple field that you're trying to represent, let's say just like first name, and or just let's say a list of names or something very simple. it's quicker to set up with return limited lists. At least that's.
If you have a short list, yes.
So there's the pros and cons. I think the pros, I agree with you totally. You told me this after I had published an article about virtual lists. You wrote me and said, try the variables, and you were right. And I think I added something to my post. But it's like everything. There are two ways to do it. They have pros and cons.
Exactly. And I use a mix. I mean, sometimes I use return to limited lists. Sometimes I use repeating variables. It just depends on how long my list is and what I'm actually trying to accomplish. Okay, so before I move on to the next slide, I just want to tell you that Jeremy was here for Christmas, and unfortunately, I booked his flight to leave yesterday, not thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, I told him that I was going to tell everybody that anything he says or does, I get to take credit up for, since I'm his mother, and he said, you are going to tell them that, right? I'm like, is that okay? He says, oh yeah, go ahead. So anyway. So I get to take credit for that quote, but that was his quote. All right, so here's a few tips about virtual lists that I'll share with you. Use variable repetitions in larger data sets, as we just talked about for obvious reasons. Also, global variables, your double-dollar variables, they allow for more complex data gathering, right? Because you can use subscripts and things. You could go in this file and you could grab some values and then send those variables over to the other file. You can go over to this layout, grab some variables, run another script, set some variables in another data set, etc. So I like to use global variables, but the virtual list technique will work with local variables as well, so long as you're starting and finishing within the same script, and you're still in your script when you go to look at running your report or looking at the data, like you've paused your script. The reason we use global variables is because we usually are setting up our variables, and then we're done and we're looking at our results, but we're no longer in a script, right? But when we use global variables, we need to remember to clear them. And that is easier to do when you're using a return to limited list. If you are doing repeating variables, to clear them, you need to know how many variables you set in the first place in order to create a loop. But I'll show you an example of that. Okay, also, if you weren't aware of this, the data in your virtual records, your virtual list records, work very much like any other FileMaker record. They can be searched, they can be sorted. They don't search quickly, but they can be searched, they can be sorted, they can even be queried with an execute SQL. And they can be queried like that, because everything in it is so performant. I don't want to overuse the word, but everything is so fast in the virtual list.
Because most of it's in local memory.
Correct. Right. Now, I suggest also, and I didn't put this on the slide, don't open your data viewer, okay? If you have a virtual list report and you have hundreds of repetitions times 5 fields or something like that, do not open your data viewer. You will regret it. There is some limit, like 29,000 or whatever. To show, but if you get a few hundred of these global variables for your virtual list, you will not want to open your data viewer. It's extremely painful. Yes. I agree. I think that would be very helpful. I also personally don't use get record number. And the reason for that is I learned early on that I can sort my virtual list records, but if I sort them by one of their values and they're using get record number, my sort's not going to do anything, right? I can sort them all day and nothing's going to happen. But if I use a serial number that's unique, ours, our CID is the name of our unique serial number fields in every table. So I use that, then you can sort by the various columns that you have in your virtual list data. So use a stored serial number instead of get record number. Yes?
Make sure you turn off delete in that table.
I'm sorry?
Make sure you turn off delete in that table. That's a hard one, the one that I did.
Uh-huh.
A record is missing from a report because we deleted that record.
Right.
My 4th row, for example, was gone.
Yes.
And then
Just coffee?
spot, that record's missing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you just explain a little bit more fully, what's the problem with sorting? I just go back to the source table, sort there, and rerun the virtual list, and then everything's kind of...
You can do that, but one of the advantages of a virtual list for a user, if you give them a report that's a UI report, where they might be able to, maybe they want to sort the columns differently. If you're using get record number, they'll sort the column by the, say the name value, but the resorting of the records will just change the record numbers of them and the values won't actually change, right? So your sort won't actually work.
It becomes your seventh record, which becomes a fifth record.
I see that.
Yeah.
How is it different with variables?
Oh, it has nothing to do with variables. It has to do with the get record number versus the serial number.
A field that is a serial number instead of get record number. So you have a field that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you reference that field in your calculation as your...
Oh, okay.
Right, which you'll see in my examples in a few moments here. And then my next point is that, your virtual list calcs, I showed you a couple, the basics, get value, get record number or get value, CID, repetition. Those can be modified to meet special requirements. And I have had the good fortune to have many special requirements to deal with. So we're going to look at some of that. And I don't know if you knew this, but variables can hold images. So you can set an icon or a form or any photo into a variable and it will work in virtual list so long as the field type in your virtual list field is container and it will pull in that visual. So that's pretty cool too. Okay, and last, virtual list fields can be named either generically or dynamically. Has anyone done dynamically named? Cool, all right. So we're gonna look at that.
You're talking about dynamically, like you name the field according to what you're filling out, or what?
Yes, yes. So the first time I started working with virtual lists, I had like data 01, data 02, data 02, data 03. But after you start using it a lot, you forget which of those fields did you put the name in? Which of those fields did you put the quantity in number 1 or number 2, or did you put the amount in number 1 or number 2 or number 3? So I just find it very confusing, and it's a table where I can add as many fields as I want, and it adds really no weight or burden to the schema whatsoever. So I add fields that are specifically named for what I'm doing. So my first example up here, I'm just showing a basic, ABC field where I've got hard coded into it, get value ABC, right? And in my second example, I'm doing dparticipant, and I'm looking at the global variable participant CID. So I'm pulling that repetition. Those are just about the simplest you can get. The problem is, I'm lazy. Okay, so I don't want to have to go in and hard code my variable names. I just want to I want to duplicate a field and change its name and it'll just work, right? So that's what I did. So I know this is real small. What is the trick to blow it up? Anyone know?
So what's dynamically named? Sounds like the variable's dynamically named.
No, other way around. So here's what I'm showing. Let me come up here. Woo! Okay, I'm attached. All right, so what I'm showing here is the first part of my calc is field equals get field name self. And then I'm parsing that and creating var name, which is $, and then basically the field name. When you get field name self, it includes the table name and the colon, right? So I get that stuff out. So I'm parsing it down and then evaluating it, creating a var. My var variable name in this case, because my field name is budget line, it's going to do get value $, budget line, and then CID is my record number. So I can duplicate this field as many times as I want, change the field name, and it'll just work with a variable that has the same name as the field.
It still seems to me like it's the variables that are being dynamically named. You create as many fields as you want, but you name them. First name, last name, middle name, address, social security number, whatever you need. And then you don't have to worry about naming the variables, because you just say, I need first name, so go to first name, go into it, get his field name, and call the variable first name.
Right.
That's dynamically naming the variable, not the field. The field's hard-coded.
But your variables are set in scripts. And that means you may have umpteen different places that you're going, because you have umpteen different scripts that are building your virtual list. This is in the virtual list table itself. That's the difference. Personally, I like this just, well, in part because it's cool, but I also like it because it's really fast for me. And I don't have, if someone else comes in and works on a script and they create another version of a variable, I can decide, well, do I just want to use this one I have and rename the field, or just duplicate it and I'll do a plural version of this because someone has added some other piece that's got a different name. It's just real easy. Yes?
Okay, I knew you covered this later on, but when you're using JSON, you just put the dots right in the
Right.
field name too, and you can grab that.
Exactly. Exactly. And here's another, the last version. There are some instances where it's good to have, and I wish that I could recall a specific example, but I learned from experience, and I use this version of it now, where my evaluate includes like get as number, get as text, get as date, things like that. And I think that's because we pull some data from SQL queries sometimes, and the format is funky. And so you'll have a field that's a number field and you try to apply currency formatting and it's like, what? Right? It just doesn't work like it should. So I am not doing that, though that would be more dynamic. You know, if I named the field numDisplay.n, then I could have different variations in my let that would do that. I haven't gone that far. I copy a number field or copy a text field or date field, yeah, and duplicate it. But I like having my field names in my virtual list table match the variables that I'm using. It's just a whole lot, it's quicker because it's easier to work with because, you know, as I've heard others say, I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but the next developer who works in your system might be you, right? Okay. All right, so why do I use a virtual list technique? It's magic, right? Okay, but more specifically, I use it for reporting, I use it for functionality, and I use it for meeting unique requirements. So let's look at some reporting. The reason I use it for reporting in UI is because it has no impact on the schema. Right? It's a standalone table. It doesn't have to be connected to anything, but it actually can. So for example, you can set a foreign key into your virtual list and then show a related field in your virtual list report, like a name. All you've saved is the ID, but through a relationship from the virtual list table, you can show related records. Yes, Taylor.
It's kind of like creating a view in the SQL system, which is kind of nice.
Exactly, exactly. So I like this because I don't have to do much to make it work. I don't have to add a lot of relationships to get complicated combinations of data all together. I don't know how many of you have done that from back in the day, but I enjoy not having to do that anymore. And JSON is a great tool for not having to do that as well. Mixed context. That's one of the biggest reasons for the virtual list in my experience. The ability to get data from this table over here and data from this table over there and put that data on the same line as though it were the same record, right? And they may not be related, okay? So the ability to merge data in ways that we really cannot do economically and feasibly without making serious schema changes, and sometimes even it's not possible. Yes?
For the user, it just ought to be that way because they just expect.
It ought to just work, right? It just ought to make sense, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's easy to repurpose.
So mixed content would include things like having a disclosure triangle where you've got a bunch of things that have like a menu, for example. And the menu, each item in the menu has got sub-items. You can show, we give people disclosure triangles, and they click, you know, the third disclosure triangle, and suddenly the sub-items for element 3 appear,
Right.
and the others are hidden, and then you can move around.
Right.
That's something that you can't do in a normal list.
Right.
And virtual lists can be very useful.
So one of the cleanest, nice examples that I have of a UI use that shows mixed context is from Matt Navarre's FM search results. Now, disclaimer here, he's not actually using a virtual list, but his technique is virtual list-like. Oh, I did it again. I am still connected. All right. So it's virtual list-like. So we'll just pretend it's a virtual list. He's actually using global fields, but otherwise the technique he's using is identical for his representation here in the UI. These are search results. So I did a search in one of our systems for Scott, just Scott. And it searches everywhere. It searches contacts, it searches notes, it searches projects. It searches all different contexts for Scott. And it returns those results in one list. So I've got some intakes where we've got Scott as the name or part of the address, and we know that there are 200 more intakes in addition to the 10 that we're showing, and they have links that I can select that'll take me to those intake records. And then I also have a number of notes that included Scott as well that it shows me, and I can select those and be taken to them as well. If we were to look at the layout, and I didn't include that here, but if we were to take a look at that, you would see that there's only one row. It's just a list view. There's no sub-summary. There's no sorting. It's just a list view with one row, except that first row has the value of intakes, tab, text results 1 to 10, etc. Already formatted with the bold and the not bold, etc. The next line, that value has Scott Brantley, bullet, etc., and so on and so forth. And when we get down to the space, we've got the ... and 200 more intakes. That's just another row.
So, I'm sorry, so all of this from here to here is one row, and this is one global field?
No. That's about 20 rows.
Oh.
Each one is a row, but each row also has a type value. So the first row has a type value of subsummary, and therefore the conditional format turns it blue, right? Okay. The next row has a type value that tells it should show that link. And the link, of course, will work against the ID that's stored in a value in that record. And then when we get down to the and 200 more intakes, it knows that that's the type of record that is, and it's included a blank space after that, a blank row before the next subsummary that shows notes, and so on. So it's really taking values not only from different contexts, but it's using this virtual approach to actually provide us with headers, subheaders, subsummaries, and other information, which I think is pretty cool. And the FM search results also does some really awesome searching that I won't get into, but I do have information on how to get to it for anyone who wants to know more about that. I'll try not to stand up and drag my mic around. I don't have pockets. Women don't get pockets. Not often. Yeah, I know. All right, so let's talk about functionality and how I use it. I use functionality can be defined, in my opinion, to cover these techniques. One, I use it virtual list for data transfer. You cannot import, for example, from one table back into itself. Yeah, you can export it and then import it, but you can't import to itself. And it's not the kind of thing we have to do often, but sometimes we actually do, and there's a good reason for it. We ought to just be able to do it, but we can't. So we can use a virtual list to accomplish the same thing. Virtual sorts are another functionality that I employ, and virtual value lists. Has anyone here used either virtual sort or virtual value lists? Okay. Okay. I know you have. There you go. Okay, so let's talk about these. So data transfer. The example I'm going to show you here is we're going to build what we call UltiPro lines from our timesheets. This is an actual timesheet in the harmonic system for ISS, Independent Support Services in New York. So we see a whole bunch of time entries for October and November, start time, end times. The ones that don't have start and end times are overtime lines, okay? So we need, for payroll purposes, to submit the summaries of this information to the payroll company UltiPro, which is why we call them UltiPro lines. They get exported and uploaded into UltiPro, they pay the checks, and then we get back the GL detail of how much money there was, et cetera. But we have to build those lines because we don't send them the individual everyday hours, but we have to send them the hours because they determine how much someone's going to get paid. We don't tell them how much they're going to get paid. UltiPro knows what they're going to get paid hourly. So we have to summarize our time entries by the month. And I'm showing here, we've got some October entries and some November entries. We also have to summarize by earnings code. So we have to pull out, for example, that PTO line of 4 hours on 10/29. That has to be separate from the 2 other 4-hour entries that are also in October because it's PTO. And the overtime, that has to be separate because they have to pay a different rate for overtime. And the PTO has to be separate because they track the PTO, how much people have used and earned, et cetera. So we have to break those down into summarized totals by month and earning code. And that is not an easy thing to do from here, because if we were going to do this as a report, we could actually just generate a report from the time items with the right sub-summaries and the right sort order, right? But we can't send them that. We can't send them just those sub-summaries in a clean way that we can go back and look at and know this is what we sent them. Because if we did that using a sub-summary and say exporting the summarized totals, if we went back to do it again tomorrow, it might not be the same, right? Somebody who shouldn't have might have done something they shouldn't have. We cannot guarantee that it's the same. So we need to produce a permanent UltiPro line. This is what we're going to send them. This is what we sent them. And then we get pay line details that come back. They get linked up to that. We prove that this is what was paid. So we got to build those, and we're going to use a virtual list to do that. So our scripting, and I know you can't read this, but basically we loop through the timesheets in a certain then we sort the time item months. We use a SQL query to pull out the months. Then we go in deeper and we do additional SQL queries to find out what our sum totals are per month and what our different earning codes are for that month. Then we loop through those earning codes and summarize them in variables. And then we get some final counts. How many records are we looking at for this timesheet and how many for all the timesheets that we've done. Then we prepare our virtual list. First thing we do is we open a new one. I like opening a new window for doing things. If I'm going to run something locally and not server side, I like opening a new utility window to put all that stuff in, because that means I guarantee I can always get back to where I started and move to the next record without any issues. So I open a new window. Then I go to my virtual value list. I run a subscript called enforce virtual value list requirement, and it confirms that in fact the virtual list table has enough records in it to hold the values that I'm going to be feeding it. And if it doesn't have enough, it'll add some more records. Do the right thing. Then I actually go to the virtual list, and then I go to my UltiPro lines table and I do an import. And there's my import mapping. I know it's hard to see, but D timesheet goes to D timesheet, D participant goes to D participant. Those are my foreign keys. Hours goes to hours. Again, I really like the cleanliness, and it's real easy to set up the import mapping if the fields are named the same. And in this case, if there are fields that exist in my virtual list table that don't exist here, it doesn't matter because they're not going to have any values in them because I didn't set them. So I'm going to create new records in my UltiPro lines table, and then I'm going to clear my variables. Like I said before, you want to keep track of what your total count was so you can loop through them. And here I'm counting using a local variable for my repetition. With my global variable, I'm incrementing my local variable until the point where it is greater than my global variable, my original count, yes.
Do that nicely with a while too.
With what? Oh, with while, yes. I could. But I'm not right now. So that's an example of clearing the variables. The one thing you do have to remember when you're doing a large virtual list build, if you will, you got to keep track of the variables you're using and make sure you add them to your clear. So I usually set up the clear part at the top of my script so that I wrap it in some if statements so it runs at the right time. And every time I add a new variable that I'm setting, I duplicate that set variable and I move it up there and set it to clear so that I can keep track of them and not end up opening my data viewer and finding that there are 300 of something I forgot about. Yes?
There isn't a way to query what dollar variables are out there.
There isn't.
That would be real nice.
I know. Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I suppose that someone could write a custom function that you would use to set your variables that would do that, but it seems real messy and I see a lot of potential problems. So, but no, that is not an option. And boy, that would be a nice ad for FileMaker to give us. Yeah. Okay, so my end result is here's my timesheet and I have UltiPro lines up here. And the breakdown, carrying my deal here, is that the green box at the top, we've got 8 regular hours in October. We've got 4 PTO hours in October. We have 43.5 regular hours in November, and we've got 43.5 overtime hours in November. It's broken them all down. We've got 4 lines exactly the way we need them. And it does this in about, I don't know, per timesheet, a half a second or so. And these timesheets can have not just, well, they're supposed to be 2-week periods, but people will put in an entry from before lunch, then after lunch. Before lunch, then I took a break. And I came back, and you can have up to like 3 entries a day. And you can have entries where you have some PTO and you have some overtime on the same day. So you can have well over 30 or more lines that it's evaluating, and it's doing it very, very quickly without the hassle of trying to make it work in FileMaker Native. So virtual sort is the next technique that I use. Basically, virtual sort allows you to sort records in your portals without modifying your schema to have weird sorts, right? And it allows you to set up one sort for your portal and add things to it without having to change your relationship at all. So here's an example. We've got some unsorted values, 2 columns, ID and received on, date. I click on the ID header and it sorts them by ID. I click that same header again and it sorts that column in descending order. I do it by the received date and it'll sort by the received date. If I hold, and I don't remember whether it's shift or option, but if I hold a certain key down and I click a second column, it'll append my sort to sort 2 columns in the order that I've defined it. Now, in the demo that Jeremy has provided online for free of the virtual sort, he actually shows an icon that shows you whether you're ascending or descending. It's one or the other, and it's pretty obvious to see, so I don't do that. It's a lot more work to do. Because I tell you, it's easier to do the virtual sort than it is to set up those icons, right? For them to see what you've done and see the results.
Go back to Scott, I asked you about this earlier. This part's easy. So you've got your table, your virtual list table that's got whatever number of records you think is more than you're ever going to need.
Right.
Let's say it's 1,000. and they have a serial number 1 to 1,000 in it that you're going to use to reference the repetitions in the global variable.
Right.
When you sort them by last name, then if somebody's name was Abrams and they were the first person in the list, but they had been record number 17, they're going to be first in the list, but their record number is still going to be 17. So they're going to refer to the global variable to the right cell in the global variable. Okay? That's it.
If this were based on values that were in a virtual list, yes, but that's not how this works. This is cooler than that and smarter than that. So, under the hood, virtual sort. So the first step is your sort order for your portal. The very first field is going to be a field called virtual sort that you're going to add to the table that's the context of your portal, right? And then on top of that, you can add, as I have here, other values that if I've sorted by this, then my next sort within that is going to be by name, by something else, and by type, okay? And honestly, I don't even, oh yes, this particular portal list was based on expenses in a batch, in a payables batch, okay? So the next piece is that virtual sort field uses a custom function called virtual sort position, and all it has as its parameter is its own CID, okay? And it's an unstored calc. When you click that column header, you're going to run a script called virtual sort by SQL, okay? And virtual sort position is the detail that you see there. The reason I included that is just to show you that if you're going to work with any sample files or modules that have been built by Jeremy, they're going to be very well documented. This is before you get to the code. And he explains what are we doing, why are we doing it, what are our requirements, what other dependencies might we have, how might we use this, and I think that's fabulous, and I really try hard to do the same thing. I'm not as good as Jeremy in that respect, but I try. Okay, so the virtual sort by SQL, and then the script itself that runs uses SQL queries to reorder the records. So all it's doing in the end is setting a virtual list value. It is a repeating, a return to limited list value of the sorted IDs. The IDs sorted in the way that you've defined them. He has some very extensive coding in there for getting the right table occurrence in order for making it work from whatever context you happen to be in at the time that you call it, so it's very portable. You can take that same portal from one context and drag those buttons and put them someplace else with basically the same parameters, and it'll just work right. So I've tried to dig into it to see, understand how it's doing, everything it's doing, and I got about, 60%, 70% through, and I went, yeah, it works, so just leave it at that. A lot of thought went into it. And then the other nice thing is it'll toggle automatically. If you're already sorted ascending, it knows that. And so you hit the same option again, it knows you've done that already, including when you do multiple columns in your sort. So it's pretty smart that way. It can also be used for sorting lists. It's not just for portals. It's really nice for portals because that's not an option we really have natively, to sort by multiple columns or to sort by columns that aren't defined in the sort order of your relationship. But we can also use it for sorting regular lists, regular record lists. Okay, the next technique that I use virtual value lists for functionality is the virtual value list, which is confusing because it sounds so much like just virtual list, and we are talking about virtual values, but this is specifically talking about a FileMaker value list where the value list fields that it's using are coming from your virtual list table. And in fact, when you set up that virtual value list, you set up that value list in FileMaker, it's going to warn you and tell you this is not going to work because these are unstored fields and we can't do this. Except it does work. And it's truly magic because it works in, well, I'm impressed by it. So I included my description of it, which is it builds dynamic as needed on the fly value lists. Jeremy's description is much more eloquent. Feel free to read it if you can. It helps developers build transient value lists. Developers can be spared most of the schema overhead associated with other techniques for value lists with programmatically specified values, and so on. It does all of that. Yes?
This is trying to work around the fact that you can't do a value list based on a calculation.
Yes, and another issue that it addressed, which he mentions at the last, preserving the sort order of the values. If you do a value list natively, it will resort your values. We don't want our values resorted. We want them in the order that we want them. And we don't want to have to rename the values in order to, like we don't want to put numbers at the beginning of something that doesn't need numbers, just in order to get our value list to work right. The virtual value list will retain the sort order that you've told it you want. Okay, so this is a virtual list in action, the virtual value list. In this case, what I'm looking at are expenses. Excuse me. So I'm looking at expense line items, and each line item has to have a budget line selected. What budget line are we going to charge for this expense line? Okay. Now, these are expenses that are going to get charged to a participant. ISS has 2,000 participants. Each one has their very own budget, their very own personal budget with their very own personal set of budget lines that are completely different from everybody else's. Now, they share some similar, they have common things, like there are multiple people who have ComHab, there are multiple people who have IDGS, and other multiple people who have, things like OTPS telephone charges or internet connections, things like that. So there are master budget lines, but who gets what is different. One person might have phone, somebody else doesn't. Also, their budgets change, and they can change at any time. So what they had available in January may not be available to them in March. So we need to make sure that when someone is entering an expense, and they enter a budget line, they select a budget line, that they cannot select budget lines that aren't available for that participant or on that date. So using the virtual value list, we click into the field and we get a value list that has all of that participant's budget lines available for us to select. Not only that, and that's what we're seeing on the left, but it's a long list because there are a lot of budget lines. So the left left screenshot is showing us the top of that value list. They have self-hired staff ComHab, they have brokerage, they have multiple IDGS categories, they have a housing subsidy, OTBS clothing and internet, etc. On the left, I'm showing it scrolled to the bottom. And you'll see a list after OTPS OTPS utilities, we have 0 pending, 1 ISS funds, 2 family pays, etc. We have 1 through 11. Those are our universal budget lines that are available for any participant. They can decide these are non-reimbursed costs. We're going to pay them, but we're not going to get reimbursed. So they can code it to that universal budget line. So we need to show not only the budget lines that belong to this person, but we need to put in our own little custom list as well. And not only that, but the last 2, CTS transition and state transition, those are only available for certain people to select. So based on who's the user, we may or may not show them those options. So we have to assemble this list from different places and with different criteria. So the way we do that, well, not the way we do that. We'll get to the way to do that on the next slide, sorry. So what I'm showing you here is the list is in play. We are in the field, and we see the value list. Over in our data viewer, the top 2 lines are our variables that were set when we entered that field. On entry to that field, we set those values. And they are the basis of our value list. So they're named virtual list, virtual value list ID list, and virtual value list display list. The value list, the virtual value list has 2 fields. So you can do an ID and a display. And you'll notice in our example here, if you look really, squint really hard, we're showing the names of those budget lines, but what's actually getting set is a numeric value. It's a string, a UUID that belongs to that, okay? So this is on-field entry. The moment that we exit that field, those variables are gone. They don't exist anymore. So it's instantaneous. We do that using on-object enter and on-object exit. Both are running the exact same script. And again, Jeremy names things very literally, so they're very easy to understand. The script name is exit script on trigger with parameter as result. Now the actual result is 1, but all it's doing is recording whatever you submitted as your parameter. And on the exit, we submit a different parameter that will clear the virtual list. So this is our calc, and you don't have to read all the detail. Basically, we're using a query to find the budget lines, one query to find the IDs, the same query, but pulling the name. And then we're using a custom function called virtual value list set, and we're providing it with the display list and the ID list. And it does the rest. Here's a more complex version where we're actually assembling the multiple lists together. So we've got 2 queries for our IDs. One is querying the data that belongs to the participant. The second is pulling our universal budget lines. Then we're concatenating those in a list for our ID list. We're doing the same thing at the bottom for our display values. And again, we're just doing a virtual value list set at the bottom with our display IDs and our ID list. And then on exit, our parameter is real simple. It's just virtual value list clear.
So you're putting these sending these into a calculated field that is used, I'm not sure calculated field that is used for the value list?
No, we are set on entry. We're running the script that is literally just setting the variable that we've provided. And in this case, we've provided a variable that is based on some queries that we've done to assemble the list. And it's just setting it into a variable.
But you have a global field that references.
And there is a field, a virtual value list field that's pulling that value, and that is what's used by the value list. Now, what's really cool about this, not only is it great because it just works on entry, and I've done some pretty complicated versions of this, and it works every time. Users wouldn't even know. It just works, okay? Now, obviously, the more data you have to query, or the more complicated your queries are, if your results were going to be, 300 lines, you might have more of a performance issue there and want to go another route. There's a number of ways that you could do it, but in this case, it just works because our list isn't actually that long, right? There is a limit on how long the list can be, and there are some hard limits that are in the documentation that Jeremy's provided with the virtual value list. There's a limitation in FileMaker, apparently, on the value list side that it is possible for you to exceed.
Much lower than that, there's a limit on how many values it's practical or advisable.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the other...
300 values you choose. I think it's better to go to another layout.
Right. And of course, we've been able to do related value lists for a long time, and that's really cool. And if all we wanted to show was this individual's budget lines, we could do that easily using a related value list. But we couldn't do that and tie in the date that's on that line. Not easily. And we couldn't do it and add our additional budget lines.
It's like a relational or a conditional value list, but much more flexible.
It's much more flexible.
But also much harder to pick.
It is not easy to build those, you know, to set it up, depending on what you want. Now, in other cases, you can use it very simply, and in Jeremy's examples, he shows examples where he's got two different fields that are showing, you know, checkbox value lists, and they're both using virtual value lists, but you can have a virtual value list 1 and a virtual value list 2 and have them both working simultaneously.
But if you just got a list of products, and you want shoes to have numeric sizes, and you want shirts to have large, small, extra large,
Right.
then this isn't the way to do it, because it's way too much work to achieve something that.
Yeah, you have to look at the whole picture of what it is you're trying to accomplish to decide whether this is a good approach or not. But it will allow you to have the exact same field using a different value list and displaying a different value list from the next record in a list view. Right.
Yeah, I think so too.
The fact that you can sort them the way you want them.
Yes.
The user logically would see them. You know, a simple example is if you have a value list of dates.
Well, in fact, and I'm not going to go backwards here, but you would have seen at the top of those value lists that it had select ... That's actually part of the value list I built.
Right. And you know, even if you look at web pages where you're entering a credit card, you have to put an expiration date, and they always have the numeral in front of the month because
Right.
it's always in alphabetical order, and the months of the year are just not logically alphabetical.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. I want to get to what I really wanted to share with you today. So now that we've covered, everybody's seen some cool stuff about virtual list techniques and some specific examples that I use. And I've given you just a few specific examples, but those techniques of the virtual value list and the virtual sort are techniques that I've used in many places, many times. It's very dependable, so I'd highly recommend those. But sometimes you have a really unique requirement. It's not exactly a report. Maybe it's a report. Maybe it's something that you have to see on screen. Maybe it's something like those search results from the FM search that you have to accomplish. And you rack your brain about how can I do this with my native FileMaker schema? And how much of a pain is that going to be, right? Maybe there's a better way. So we have, again, ISS in New York, one of our largest clients and my primary client, which is why all my examples are from there. They have a state billing requirement. So basically, they manage the budgets for all of the participants in their program. They serve the developmentally disabled community in the state of New York. So all of their clients have varying degrees and levels of developmental disabilities, and they have been given budgets that are covered by Medicaid in part and by the state, the OPWDD, which is the Office for Persons with Developmental Disabilities in the state of New York. So some of the costs that we're paying from that expense that we had all those different budget lines, some of those budget lines, I mean, we're going to pay the expense and reimburse whoever needs to be reimbursed, but then we're going to turn around and bill either Medicaid or OPWDD for those costs that we put out, right? So the stuff that goes to Medicaid, we do electronically, right? That's a breeze. No problem. We generate those things every day. They can be adjusted every day. New costs come in, go against the same budget lines that we already billed for. We just send an adjustment and it's just electronic and it just works. But the state, they want like these paper forms and they look like this. Now, yeah, now they did actually used to do this in paper. They will now accept an emailed PDF. So these are now PDF'd and sent to them. But this is what they look like. They have a cover page that has the grand total, and then they have detail pages which have some challenges. So let's talk about why we decided to go with a virtual list for this report. And the blocked out stuff is just because these are like actual names and actual historic. This is taken from an actual PDF from September of 2018, okay? So the first issue that we had is that we have to manipulate the data because we're paying expenses for our participants based on their budgets. And their budgets are predefined to have X number of how many, whatever budget lines have been assigned to them. And for however many dollars they've been assigned to each budget line. So we have a number of bill types that we use for those costs, but none of them match up exactly the same to the types that we have to categorize them as on this report. So we have 6 bill types that are getting billed to the state, but they only give us 4 options. So 3 of those bill types we have to merge into one called BSSD, and then the other 3 we have to rename to match the naming conventions that they've provided, which is that second block there. So we have to provide them as VL, MES, OPRA, other, or BSSD. Those are our only options. And VL is vehicle lease. I mean, that's an obvious assumption, but it's not VL in the budget, it's vehicle lease, right? So we have to convert that data. We have to translate these things and convert it. So that's one issue. The biggest part of that was the merging of the 3 types, the 3 bill types. Now, we also have a limit on the form. There are 9 rows on here, and we have to have a total of those 9 rows. On every page, it has to have a total of the page. Now, if you were doing this without a virtual list, okay, you could manipulate and configure something that has, you know, a header part or something up there that's, so your body is your list of only 9 and it's sub-summarized in some way or something, but how painful would that be? And what about the fact that, notice the very first pink circle up there is September 2018. Well, what if we're sending a bill that includes October? Well, October has to be on a completely separate page. But if we only had, as we do here, 7 lines for September, we need 2 blank lines before we can start the next page. And how are we going to do that in normal FileMaker records, right? We can't do that without like creating bogus records. We don't want to, that's a workaround, right? We don't want workarounds, we want a solution, right? So those are some of the constraints. And then of course the cover page, and this example just shows 1 month on there, but there could be a dozen months, and each one has to be on here as its own total. So that is totaling however many pages there were for September. Actually, this screenshot is from an August copy, sorry. So there's our total for August, and then the sum at the bottom has to be the total of all the months that have been submitted. Again, those are sub-summaries that we got to put on that cover page, but we got to be able to generate both at the same time.
You have more than 9, you have to have a second cover page?
You can have a second cover page. Historically, there's only been 1 time that it's gone over. And the limit right now, I think, is 17 or 16 per right now that we can put on there. So a virtual value list takes care of it if it's the need. So here was our script for building those virtual values, and you'll notice there's 4 chunks, basically for those 4 different types. And what we're doing here is we're just doing a test to say, are you this type or this type or this type? If so, set this amount. And then each one of them has this detail. If we had the amount, then we set the variables for that row. If we have it, we increment our row number, and we set the variables for the name, the tabs ID, the rate code, the amount, and the units. All right, our layouts look like this, and I'm using repeating fields. So my virtual value list table, my virtual list table has unstored calculations pulling from variables with 9 repetitions each. Okay, now actually I have 12 repetitions on my cover page and 9 repetitions on my detail pages. And then I have some summary totals that are super easy in FileMaker because I just do a sum of that field, a sum of that repeating field, and it just does the right thing. So that worked really well. And we were pretty pleased with that for a while. It required a little manipulating and customizing of those virtual list fields though. So here are the actual calcs, and notice because it's a repetition, we have the extend of the CID. The way I'm doing this is I multiply that by 9, then I subtract 9, and then I add the repetition number, and that becomes my R value my repetition that I'm pulling from the variable. So let me show you how that, let me break that down. So if I'm on record number 1, I multiply it by 9, I subtract 9, I add the repetition. That gives me 9 minus 9 equals 0. I add to that my repetition, so my first virtual list record is going to contain records rows 1 through 9. Record 2, following the exact same calc, is going to give me rows 10 through 19, and so on and so forth. So basically, I don't have thousands or hundreds of virtual list records. I have maybe 100 to 200 virtual list records, each of which contain up to 9 rows of data. I am also setting the cover page details because I'm summarizing that stuff when I'm in my loop. I'm also summarizing my months because I've sorted my records that way to begin with. And so here are a few of the other calcs, just to show you can sum, a virtual list field, and it works great. And I've had up to a couple thousand records in here doing the same thing with no performance impact at all. I would say if you're doing tens of thousands, this is probably not the way you want to go, but this works very nicely. And the results, abracadabra, virtual list the magician, pulled it off. Virtually and literally, it was a success, so take about a magician V virtual list.
Summing you're summing the repetitions on the same record.
Correct. Actually, on my cover page for my monthly total, I'm actually doing a SQL query of my virtual list table by month. Yes, and that is summing my month values. So, yes. Yep. So this is actually like 1,400 rows in here, making up that million, like $1.2 million. And it's just like that. It takes about 30 seconds to build these values for the whole thing. It works very, very quickly. Oh, but wait. Has anyone here seen the Forky shorts from Toy Story's Forky character? He has one, it's what are friends? And he decided that this cup with a smiley face on it, the ceramic cup, is a friend. And he goes through this whole routine. But the friend's name is, what? No! Because every time Molly's mom is on the phone with a friend, she says, what? No! Constantly. So, what? No. So it didn't work because apparently meeting the requirements does not always meet the needs. And so we learned this with time. The virtual list was great. We were really thrilled with it. But there were some things missing. The first thing that was missing was we couldn't compare multiple reporting periods at the same time. We couldn't look at 2 reports simultaneously. We had to save them as PDFs outside of the system. So the way that they look historically at months would be to go to the folder with all the PDFs in it and open the PDFs. Well, I'm a file maker person. This is not how it should be. It just is not right, right? It's not easy. It's doable, but it's not easy. The temporary nature of the virtual list also prevented us from accurately reproducing those reports. Because the nature of the way the billing works is that we don't just bill once for the same thing. If additional expenses came in that we paid, we're going to bill again for the difference. But we need to know how much we billed the first time. And we're not storing that. There are in the background claim records, but they can change daily and they get updated. When new bills come in, we update the old bill to see what the change is to decide whether or not we need a new bill. So we can't look at the old bills and get an accurate representation of what we actually sent to the state 2 weeks ago, or 3 months ago, or a year ago. So that caused some cash flow issues because They want to bill as much as they possibly can and know that it's accurate. And they have 3 months, they have 90 days to submit the first claim. Now, once they've submitted the first claim, they have 2 years to update it and do adjustments. And so they do have plenty of time to pay more expenses, but they've got to send that first bill in at least 90 days. And they want it to be as much as possible. So they were waiting until like day 85. Okay, and did any of you notice the amount of that invoice? It was $1.2 million. And they're waiting almost 90 days to submit the claim. Not good, not good. So we had to give them a better way, and that basically meant we needed something that was storable. So in comes JSON, our superhero. She's kind of cute too, and very flexible. Now, the reason she's a superhero is because JSON can do all the same stuff that the magician can do, right? They can manipulate the data, can reorganize the data, can pull from multiple contexts, and do all the same things and then some. But we can store it, which means that we can recall it and we can regenerate it, right? It's flexible, it's storable, and it's performant. Build it right, it's very fast. Build it wrong, not so much, right? But build it right, it's very fast. So let's take a look at how we did that. First thing we did was you did have to add some schema because we're going to store some stuff, right? So naturally, the 3 tables that are purple are what we added. I added the submissions table. That's the actual, we submitted something to the state record. This is when we submitted it. This is the period that it covered, etc. We have a join from that to the actual claims. The claims are what we loop through in order to build our virtual list, right? So we now have a join for that, and I added state pages. So we actually have a record for each page, and that makes it more performant. Now, we could just store everything in the submissions table and build our pages out and have our 167 pages or whatnot look at that, but that wouldn't be as fast as just storing the JSON for that page in its own record. It also makes the context easy. The cover page is in the context of the submission record. Our detail pages are in the context of the state pages record. So that makes sense. Now, our workflow for gathering the data had to be a little bit different. Basically, what we did before, we located the claims that we're going to process. We looped through them, but instead of setting some virtual variables, some global variables, we're building JSON, and through a create relationship from claims to claim submission, we're creating a claim submission record and setting JSON into it as well. So if something ever broke in one place or another, we've got what we need right there. We can do other things with it as well. We could assemble reports from claim submission records that cover multiple submissions if we wanted to. We've got what we need. Our next step is we update the submission record. We set the JSON that includes everything in the report. We set a page count and our monthly sums, which we've gathered along the way as we're doing our JSON. And then we add the page records. We don't have to set anything into them. We just create them with the foreign key to the submission, and they look at the JSON from the submission and get their values from that, okay? So that's how we gather them, and this is our script. That's the core of the script. Now, you remember that other script? And you remember some of the other scripts with subscripts and other big pieces that were like 200 plus lines long? There are a couple things that aren't in this screenshot at the end. They're just kind of some cleanup things, but that's basically it. That's all we have to do is we're looping through our claims to build this. We set 2 JSON values. We set the parent JSON, and we set what we're going to put in that claim submission record. So we're setting 3 fields. We're setting in that claim submission what page is it on and what row is it. Now, of course, we sorted our records first before we did this. And once that's done, we set a couple details into our submission. We set the JSON that we built, and we set the total page count, and we're done. So this is the JSON calc, where we're building our JSON. And easy peasy, right? everybody understands exactly what it's doing, right? Okay, there is some logic here. So the first section here is defining the major pieces. So I'm going to come over here for a second. So the first thing we're testing is, what is our date of service for this claim? Because we need to know whether we've moved to a new month or not, right? And we combine year and month because you could actually have a submission that has 2 Decembers in it from 2 different years, right? Because we can do large date ranges. We also set the row. And the first thing we check is, if the row currently is 9, well then we need to set our row to 1 because we got to start a new page, right? So if we're already 9 or our month has changed, then our row number is 1. Otherwise, we're going to increment our row number. The next is we're going to set our page. Basically, that's real simple. If our row number is 1, we're going to increment our page. Otherwise, we're just going to use the existing page that we'd already set. We also then pad the page, not in a variable, but just in a part of the let statement, because we're going to use that in our address for our JSON. And then, of course, we update our global YYYMM year month. So we do a little housekeeping to figure out where we are at the beginning. The next step is we're going to define the addresses that we're going to use. Now, you can take these pieces and you can put them down in the calcs in your set element, but I like this because it's a whole lot cleaner for me to understand. Again, I might be the next one who has to come in here and work with this and change something. So I predefine the different addresses. So my first address is the page. It's literally is page space, and then that page value that I've padded, then dot, then the year month, dot, row, and then the row number. So that's my base address for everything I'm setting into the big JSON. And then I go ahead and define the addresses for the claim, name, tabs, type, units, the things that are going to be on the row. And I've named those add claim for address of the claim number, add name for address of the name, etc. So that when I get down here, I set my actual values for this particular claim that I'm looping on. And I set those into those local variables. And those local variables go into that second JSON that was in the script. And there I'm just setting into the claim submissions JSON, name, row, tabs, type, and units. No addresses needed there, just the values go in there. But then on the next section, I'm updating my master JSON that's going into the submission. And all I'm saying is my address is add claim, add name, add tabs, type, et cetera, real simple. And the global or local variables that I set in the step above for this record, they get appended to the master JSON. My layouts look very similar to what they did before, but I replaced those virtual list fields with button bars. Everybody loves button bars, right? They're so awesome. We can do anything with our button bars. So I have a 15 button bar on my cover page, and I have a 9 button bar, or a series of 9 button bars on my detail page. And I can use a sum field for the totals at the bottom, my underscore bill units and underscore bill amount sum, because those are the sums that are in that state pages record. So everything is local, and my calcs on this record that I'm looking at, which is a state pages record, each one of those 9 calcs in the buttons is looking at the JSON that lives in that record. So my calcs look something like this, and I know that's tiny, sorry, but basically each button, the first step is it sets which row it is, which button number it is. My R, what's my label name here? So I can duplicate these buttons, and all I have to change are those first 2 values, and the rest just works. There's a couple minor exceptions, like in the amount. We have to show a .00, but our amounts don't have that because they just don't. So, but we don't want to show .00 if we have a blank row. So this one has just an extra step in it where it's checking to see, does it have a value at all before it provides the value. And our cover page does a value count of what we set into JSON months, which I didn't get into, but that's another piece we said. That gives us our summary lines for the cover page. And we use a custom function, JSON get all values, pull from that. And basically, if our count is less than 17, we show the dollar formatted value. Otherwise, we show the text continued ... because there's a page 2. Right, yeah. So we can put that right in our calc. Our monthly amounts pull again from the JSON months. We just wrap it in some dollar formatting. And our monthly description basically pulls the month and formats it properly so it displays. And we get this. Now it looks a little different than the example I gave you before because they changed their form and they added a cool purple logo at the top. But basically it's the same as before, only I've de-identified the data so I don't have the big blocks in the way and you can see it a little bit better. So we get the same result, but we're doing it with the JSON instead, which means that we now have a submission record. And it's got our JSON, which is organized by page, the month, then each row, and all the data on each row. So, and if you were to click into that field and scroll down, you would see like 1,400 different rows on all the different pages. So it's organized very cleanly. We're storing here the starting month and ending month for what we've covered here, and the count of pages. So we have 165 pages. Our state pages, we have 165 records, and there's the JSON, the raw JSON and the formatted JSON of the 9 rows that live there. Now, we didn't have to set anything into here other than the submission ID and the page number, and it pulled that JSON from the submission records JSON. It pulled its chunk out of it, which makes that really fast. It's an auto-enter calc that pulls that, so it's not live. But yeah, when we create these records, it literally just pulls those, and I use some calcs to sum the amounts that I'm pulling out of the JSON. Yeah, I pull the amounts from the values in here. And we have a custom function that does that. And our row records are very simple. We have that JSON as well for that row. This is what we submitted. So we can, at any time, go back, and this is what it was. We can manipulate this further, put this somewhere else, do other things with it. And it takes just like a few seconds. I tried to time building the virtual list versus building this, and they're just too fast. There's just not enough difference. So I want to give some credit to Bruce Robertson, who invented the virtual list sometime around 2009, and the FM search results by Matt Navarre, and of course Jeremy. If you want to look into the virtual value list or the virtual sort, you can go to Modular FileMaker, and they're there. And AppWorks is where the FM search results is available. And I'd like to thank Lynette Sikora, our illustrator, for her JSON, her virtual magician and her JSON superhero.